Okay. When we took care of the church in Oregon, we had the church in Oregon was at a place where they used to have a real gold rush, and many, many thousands of people had gone into that little community to try and dig gold out of the mountains. All right. Almost everybody believed that almost all the gold was gone already, but we had a friend in the church. His name was Kurt, and he had a gold mine. And when my 3 Phoenix living grandchildren came up for a visit, he said, "Would you like to go up and see my gold mine?" Well, who wouldn't want to go to the gold mine? I mean, it was a no-brainer. And he got us in his little Jeep that he used, and he climbed up the mountain pathways up through and took us into the gold mine. All it looked to me like was just a whole lot of hard work. But he had said he found some gold in the gold mine. And he was so pleased when he brought us down to the bottom of the mountain again, and he showed us a glass tube where he'd collected all of the golden nuggets he'd gotten out of that gold mine. There weren't very many. But he was so excited about it. I have that same excitement sharing with you about the Gospel of John. And I love the Gospel of John. I think it's the most blessed gospel of all because it was written by his very best friend, and it is so awesome to hear the perspective of the Gospel of John. But here we have our last of our 4 lessons, all right? And so this will be the last trip up the mountain to walk around in the gold mine and see if you can share some of the excitement about all the interesting things that happen. And in the process, we're going to do 2 things primarily. We're going to finally look at the 7th miraculous sign that John puts in his group of 7. And then we're going to look at the discourses. I was so happy. Pastor Jonathan is preaching out of the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And he's preaching out of the words of Paul. Well, if you are able to open up the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians and read down through it, you'll see that Paul is doing the very same thing that John does in teaching by discourse. Now the other the other Gospels show Jesus teaching by parables. A parable is a little story, a simple, easy to understand story that tells the message and teaches the lesson, all right? John doesn't do that. He calls them discourses. And so with the idea of teaching with discourses, that's a very Jewish tradition. And so Paul, being a very trained theologian, he had gone up through all of the levels of education, was sitting as a student of Gamaliel, if you remember the story of Saul and Paul. He had been taught in the absolute highest level of Jewish tradition, and that's called discourse, teaching by discourse. And that's what he does in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Okay, but I seem to connect better with the parables, because I like the little stories. The man went into his field to sow this, and some of it fell on rocky ground, and some of it fell on weedy ground, and some of it fell on the path. That's a parable. And I love listening to the parables. But John does something a little different. Today, we're going to finish the 7th miraculous sign. Then we're going to talk about the discourses. All right? The 7th miraculous sign happens in the 12th chapter of, actually the 11th chapter of John. And it is the raising of Lazarus. Okay? So here's what I want to do first, to just give you a sense. In the Gospel of John, Jesus has many Jerusalem friends, and he has many experiences teaching and preaching in Jerusalem. In fact, it is in the Gospel of John that we finally learn that Jesus had a 3-year ministry. Now, how do we know he had a 3-year ministry? Well, he went to 3 separate Passover celebrations that are once a year in Jerusalem. But we only get that from the Gospel of John. None of the other Gospels tell us about other trips. All the other Gospels talk about is this one trip at the end of Jesus' Galilean ministry, where he comes to Jerusalem for the triumphal entry and the crucifixion. Okay? But for John, he is a regular attender at the temple. He's a regular person who talks with people and has good friendships in Jerusalem. The story of Lazarus is one of his very good friends. Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, you recognize very quickly as being friends of Jesus, because Mary has chosen a better thing, and I'm not going to take it away from her. Remember the story of Mary and Martha having a debate about who's going to wash the dishes or whatever, okay? Well, that's the same family, and they lived at a place called Bethany. Now, Bethany is a suburb of Jerusalem. All right, so if I'm going to draw with my hands, the temple sits up on a mountain. As you walk out the main entrance of the temple, you drop straight down the side of that mountain. The temple wall sits right on the edge of the mountain. And you walk down a very, very steep path into what we know as the Kidron Valley. Now, the Kidron Valley is where Jesus went to pray. The Garden of Gethsemane is down there, and it's down in the Kidron Valley, right at the base. You look up, and the wall of Jerusalem looks like it's 1,000 feet above your head, down in the valley of Kidron. And if you look this way, continuing east, you'll look up the side of the Mount of Olives. All right? So the Mount of Olives sits exactly opposite the temple. One on one side of the valley of Kidron, one on the other. Now, in Jesus' day, the Mount of Olives was completely covered with trees. It had been planted for generations with olive trees, Mount of Olives, figs, dates. I mean, it had every kind of fruit-bearing tree all over the side of the mountain. And when you look at it today and you see it's a big, bare, steep mountainside, you go, what's attractive about that? Well, the Romans cut all the trees down when they decimated Jerusalem and they leveled it. They cut down all the trees off of the Mount of Olives, completely destroyed the economy of the area around Jerusalem, because that's where all the money had come from to help support things. But it had, in Jesus' day, it was a cool, shaded, wonderful mountainside. And yes, the pathway kind of twisted up the steep mountainside, and you kind of looped back on yourself. But when you got to the top, you got to Bethany. So Bethany is where Lazarus, Mary, and Martha lived. They could look down and see the temple in Jerusalem, and they were so close that you could walk it on the Sabbath day. Remember how strict the Sabbath rules are? But you could still walk from Bethany to the temple on the Sabbath day without breaking the rules. So they were neighbors. And so Lazarus, Mary, and Martha were very, very well known. Lazarus was a godly man. He loved God. He certainly was a very close friend of Jesus. Mary and Martha loved God. They were very well known. In the story, Lazarus got sick. Mary and Martha sent messengers to Jesus and said, "Your friend Lazarus is at the point of death. Come quickly." and help us. And Jesus did not go quickly. In fact, he waited and told his disciples, okay, I know now that Lazarus has died. He's fallen asleep. He's no longer with us. Before he actually started the journey to Bethany. All right? And he started the trip to Bethany within a week of his crucifixion. You see, this is a very tight timeline. It's very, very important to realize it was not random. This was planned by God. Remember the boy who was born with the misshapen eyes? Who sinned, this boy or his parents? This was done so God could display his glory. And he did. Well, this was also for God to display his glory. All right? So Jesus arrives in Bethany. Mary and Martha run out to greet him. Oh, Master, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. All right? We've already looked at one of the lessons where Jesus sent his angels, his multitude of the heavenly host, to do a healing work. So it wasn't that Jesus had to be there. Jesus certainly knew that Lazarus was sick and dying. He could have called out to his multitudes and had him healed, but that was not God's plan. There was one more miraculous proof that needed to be done. And so when he arrived, the town of Bethany was in a state of chaos. It was a state of agony and grieving. I wish I still had the voice to share with you the sound of what it sounds like when Jewish women are grieving. All right? There are officially mourners in the Jewish tradition. And they scream in the highest levels of soprano voice with a trill. But it's a scream with that kind of trill in it that's just ear-piercing. What it's supposed to mean is, my heart is broken, and so are your eardrums. It's sort of that kind of a deal, all right? The entire community was grieving. The people who lived in Jerusalem were grieving. The business people were grieving because he was very well known to them. The temple leadership were grieving because he'd been a very godly man. The entire community had come out of Jerusalem, climbed up the Mount of Olives, and were sitting around the community of Bethany. Sitting Shiva in the Jewish tradition is probably about a week-long or more tradition. Jesus arrived on the fourth day, so the crowds were at their maximum. Everybody who was anybody in Jerusalem was there. Now, have I painted you a very pretty picture of what's happening? Let's read the scripture and then we kind of see how this all works, all right? This is 11:38. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. He said to Mary and Martha, take me to where he's buried, okay? Came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. This is verse 39. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he's been in there for 4 days. Jewish tradition says that you had to be buried on the day that you died. Within a 24-hour period, you had to be put into the tomb. No embalming, no preservation. There wasn't anything they could do. Decay started almost immediately. If you've never smelled the smell of death, you'll never forget it once you do, period. All right? It is really bad odor. And he's been in there for 4 days. Verse 40, then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? See, this is the purpose, so that you can know for sure, so that you can be absolutely certain, all right? See the glory of God. So, they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. They can know for sure. And when he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Now, we've been asking questions of these miraculous signs. What does it teach us? How important is it? Where does it fit in the comparison between Moses, who was the great foundation stone of the Israelite people, Israelite nation, and how does it impact us today? The seventh miraculous sign is almost like the point on the top of a pyramid. You can't put the point on the top of the pyramid until you've built the base. You see, you have a very tiny little point if you put it right on the ground. So you build the base all the way up through the six miraculous signs, so that the seventh sign is the capstone over all of them. Okay? For the Gospel of John, the raising of Lazarus is the capstone that makes all the rest of them make sense. Because Lazarus walked out of the tomb after being dead and buried for 4 days. Now, what does that tell us? Well, let's go back to Genesis, the first chapter, first verse. In the beginning, God created. All right? And how did God create? Everything. Magic wand?
Oh. He spoke.
He just spoke. He commanded it. He commanded it. And all of a sudden, the entire universe was created. The seas were created. The land was created. The life of both sea and land were created. And everything was created by speaking it into existence. Now, let's see the hands of all that believe that's true. Okay, it's universal. How could he do that? Prove it to me. Come on. You believe it. Prove it to me. Come on. Were you there to see it? Did you hear the command? Yeah. Well, the problem with creation is that nobody was there to witness it. Only Adam was created, we're told, by God pulling together the dirt of the earth and breathing into it his spirit, become a living soul. But he came along after everything else was created. He couldn't witness it. So we're left without any way to know that God created what he created. Now we're stuck. Not quite.
Except Lazarus.
What was the hardest thing in all of Genesis to create? What was the hardest thing? An elephant? It's big. A whale? It's also big. A bird? Well, it's got the ability to fly. A fish, which, by the way, doesn't drown when it goes into water, which is kind of unique.
Well, man took more effort. Man took more effort because he had to actually form him.
I love it. He used his physical creative juices to put this person together. And then into this vessel, he breathed into it something that had never been a part of the earth before. A man is the hardest thing to create, most difficult. Okay, now, let's say you wanted to prove that God created everything. So let's say I'll create something. Let's say I'm going to create a bird by speaking it into existence. Would that prove that he created everything? No, because a bird's kind of, well, it's not easy, but it's not like a man. If I wanted to create something, I could make a big animal like a lion or a tiger. Very impressive, but it's still not as complicated as a man. But if I create a man that you know, that you grew up with, that you respected, that you loved, from simply speaking the words and then giving you each a chance to talk with him, to investigate the miracle, to say, do you remember when we jumped off that rock into the river and you broke your toe? You still got that bent toe? Yeah. Do you remember the two girls we went out with and went for riding in the country? Well, yeah, I still have all my memories. I still have all my feelings, all my relationships. I still know everything I knew before. Do you still have that scar that you got when you fell off your donkey? Yeah, see, right here. And the miracle was so perfect, not only did God create a whole new body exactly as it had been before, he brought the personality, the memory, the spirit, the soul of Lazarus back together, and it was a unified whole. And everybody knew him. And they had a party. And everybody came. Just so they could see for themselves if it was real. And you know what? It was so real, it was so perfect. The leaders of the temple said, according to the fourth gospel, now that we have this miraculous sign, everybody will believe in Jesus if we don't kill him. And we have to kill Lazarus, our friend, besides, because the miracle is too perfect. It was too perfect. So you see, the seventh miraculous sign is really incredible. It is the capstone of everything Jesus said and did. It is the pinnacle of what he did. Okay, do you have any questions or anything? Recreation. 3 words. Lazarus, come out. I don't know, it kind of makes goosebumps all over me. I've been studying for 40 years, 45 years, and it still makes goosebumps because it's just so powerful. Now, almost immediately following the party, Jesus is going to walk down that walk from Bethany down the Mount of Olives and do what we call the triumphal entry. It is his victory celebration. He has overcome everything, including death. Now, who was there to celebrate? Where does it come in the Jewish calendar? Where are we talking about?
Palm Sunday?
It's Palm Sunday is the triumphal entry. You're exactly right. It is the preparation for Passover. Palm Sunday that we celebrate was actually just the opening days of the Passover festival, feast of the Jewish calendar. The most powerful of all of them because it was the remembrance of the death angel going over in Egypt. All right? So was it a big crowd? Was it big? In fact, the Romans at one point, shortly after the time of Jesus, wanted to find out just how many people actually showed up to this hard to count a lot of big crowds because you don't get a crowd estimate. You don't have drones that you can look down and say, okay, well. So what they did is they required the priest, every time they had a sacrifice of one of the lambs, to take a kidney out of the body of the lamb and put it in a pile. And at the end of the celebration, they had people come in and count the number of organs that had been put in that pile. And it was counted over 600,000. Now that's just the sacrificial lambs. And the lamb was to feed a family. And sometimes two families, if you had a small family, like ours, or sometimes you'd have several lambs to feed a larger group, all right? So, but there were certainly more people than actual sacrifices, and they still had 600,000. Now what that meant is the whole, in our backyard we have anthills, and we look down when we see one appear, and it's just like the whole ground is covered. It's like every little stone is covered with ants all moving around. And that would be what it was like on Palm Sunday, our calendar, when Jesus was coming down the mountain. People had come from all over the country, all around the world, to stake out their little shaded favorite spot close to where their friends were. You know how we do tailgating today? Well, people have been coming to Passover for years and years and years. They had their little favorite spots. They'd camped out under the trees. And when they heard that Jesus was coming and that he had raised Lazarus, everybody wanted to see, everybody wanted to be there. And so the crowd was enormous. The walls of Jerusalem were echoing, vibrating with the sound of the shouts of the people. And so that was the context of what the triumphal entry was. Days after Lazarus was raised, everybody was there. They wanted to see what was going to happen next. Okay? So that's the seventh miraculous sign, and I'm just about out of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just simply fly over the great discourses. At the top of this page, you'll see the great discourses. And we want to give you a chance to look at them. These are not parables, these are teaching moments. And so in the first one, it's a private time, a private conversation between Jesus and a man from Jerusalem who was a very powerful member of the Sanhedrin named Nicodemus. He was also a friend of the writer of the fourth gospel, a very close friend. Nicodemus was one of the most senior members of the Sanhedrin Council. And if you read the story of Nicodemus, he comes to Jesus in the evening, and here are the words he says. Son, okay, he didn't exactly use that word. We know you're a man sent by God because nobody could do the miraculous things you're doing if he wasn't. Okay? Jesus stops him. He said, you cannot be a part of my kingdom if you're not born again. And Nicodemus went into shock. Totally into shock. Now, let me draw you a picture of what was happening here. If you walked into the throne room of the Caesar in Rome, pretty powerful guy, and you walked in and you said, son, we know you're a powerful guy. We can see the effect of your power. What would the king say to you? You have no right to evaluate me. I am the king. You don't get to stand over me and tell me if you approve that I am the Caesar. So what he would do is he would say, no, I'm the Caesar, you're not the Caesar. That's what Jesus did. When Nicodemus said, we know that you're a man who's come from God, who's being used by God, he was actually standing over him, said, we own the house. We run the house. And we're trying to figure out if we're going to give you approval to speak in our house or not. And Jesus turns it around immediately and said, I own the house, and you have to get your head on straight. That's kind of crude, I'm sorry. But he uses the phrase, born again. Now, we think of that as being a normal expression. You have to be born again. We sing about it all the time. It's a part of our Christian culture. But do you realize that Jesus only said it once? And in this conversation? Why? If it was so important, why doesn't he say it over and over and over and over and over? Because it had a very specific meaning to Nicodemus. He knew exactly what it meant. He'd used it hundreds of times, maybe even thousands. And here's the way it was used. If you were a Gentile who had been born of Gentile parents, and you wanted to become a follower of Yahweh, a Jewish person, they would put you through a process where you would be baptized, put under the water as a Gentile person, and raised up out of the water as a Jewish person. You follow? You had died to your Gentile identity, and you were raised to life in your Jewish identity. And you had to start all over again. You had to learn what to eat, what not to eat, how to wear clothes that were very different than you'd ever done, how to think, how to talk, how to worship, everything. It was like going to boot camp all in one time. It was like a crazy makeover. Totally rebuilt in the form of a Jewish person. And Nicodemus reared back. But I am Jewish. Why would I have to be born again? I was born of a Jewish mother. I can't go back and ask her for permission to be born a second time. She'd refuse. I can't go back to the same roots and go back through school again. It's foolish. I've already been through that. I've got all my diplomas hanging on my wall at home. You follow? I've got my PhD in being Jewish. How can you say I am a Gentile that knows nothing? I have to go back to eating baby food again. He was upset. But Jesus simply said, if you don't start with that, you can't be a part of the kingdom. You can't be a part of me. And he goes through the whole thing. And John 3:16 is there. It's John 3:17. Wonderful passages. It is also the place where Jesus said, if I be raised up, lifted up, I will draw all men to me. Referring to the old example of Moses lifting up the brass serpent that had been nailed to the top of a pole and then stood it in the middle of the camp so everybody could see it. And if you had been bitten by the serpent and you carried the venom, all you had to do is look up there and the venom would have no effect. Okay? And Jesus is referring specifically to that event and said, if I am lifted up, just like that serpent was, long, long ago, I will draw all men to me, not just to remove the venom, but to give them eternal life, to remove all sin, every stain. And he tells that to Nicodemus as he's going through. Now, my sense is the story of Nicodemus does not end at the end of that little conversation, the discourse that they had. Because Nicodemus appears 2 more times in the 4th gospel. He stands up to defend Jesus in one of the Sanhedrin council meetings, and they laugh him down. They ridicule him and humiliate him and said, "What, have you become a follower of his also?" And then Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus received permission to take the body of Jesus down off the cross and prepare it for the burial after he dies on Friday. Okay? So Nicodemus does come to finally see Jesus, the one who was raised up on the pole, as the one that gives life, the one that gives forgiveness and grace. So he actually climbs the ladder to release the body of Jesus from the pole and prepare him for burial. He's the one who purchases 75 pounds of all the herbs and spices they put with him when his body is buried in Joseph's tomb. Okay? So Nicodemus becomes a follower of Jesus. He is the highest of the high officials on the Sanhedrin, and he comes to be a part of Jesus, partly because of the discourse that they had where Jesus says you have to start from scratch. You have to put away what you think you know so that you can hear what I have to teach you. Okay? First discourse. Second discourse. The first public discourse is with the Jewish leaders in chapter 5, verse 16 to 47. That is just sort of the beginning. When Paul does his 1 Corinthians 15 discourse, it's like a person, like a prosecuting attorney, building his case. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Each is built on the one previously. And finally it comes to the end where the final statement is also the summary of everything, and it's very, very powerful. In these discourses, the same thing happens. And the first public discourse is very quiet. It's very quiet. If you read these verses, 16 to 47, you'll see that Jesus is actually dialoguing with the Jewish leaders for the first time in public. But there's not a lot of confrontation. It's going to get more intense than that. All right? In chapter 6, verses 26 to 51, there is what we call the bread and manna of life discourse. Now that happens after Jesus feeds the 5,000, and they come to him and say, "Do it again." We were satisfied yesterday, but today's a new day and we're hungry again. Help us. Give us something to eat. And he talks about how I am the bread of life. The bread of heaven, the manna discourse, is the first one where he actually begins to claim in first-person words, I am the one who came from heaven to give you life-sustaining bread. Okay? And it causes quite a stir. There, right at the end, is chapter 6, verse 52 to 59. If you look on your page here, it's called the Communion Discourse. In the Gospel of John, Jesus does not have a Passover meal with the disciples on that Thursday night. He doesn't give them the bread. He doesn't give them the cup. This is not my new covenant given for you. There's none of that in the Gospel of John. Okay? There are in the other three, it was a Passover meal, a Seder. And I love taking my congregations through a Seder meal so that you get all the meaning that's there of the shank bone and the bitter herbs and all the things that were involved. in having the Passover meal. But in the Gospel of John, it is not Passover. Passover doesn't happen until the next day on Friday night after sunset. Now, why is that important? Because Jesus, in the Gospel of John, was the sacrificial lamb. He was the Lamb of God that was sacrificed to take away the sins of the world. All right? All of the lambs on Passover were being killed, sacrificed, and prepared for the meal, for that evening meal, from 12 noon till about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday. In the exact same time that Jesus was hanging on the cross, it has all the 7 things that he says as he's dying, giving his mother to his beloved disciple and all those things, is the process of having the sacrificial lamb killed so that the Seder meal can be done after the sun goes down on Friday night. So it's not, in the Gospel of John, what happens on Thursday is very, very, very important. But it is not Passover meal. Now, I'm going to go back to Williams. What conversation we had earlier. Which one's the dependable gospel? Well, they all are. How can you have one say Thursday is the Passover meal and one say that Friday is the Passover meal? This is where it gets fun, all right? If you calculate the days according to the calendar that God gave, you take the first phase of the moon and the number of days afterwards, that's called Passover, according to the Old Testament calculations. But it causes problems because it can land on any day of the week, depending on when the moon comes up and how it's calculated. It could happen on Monday, it can happen on Thursday, it can happen just about any time. If it happens to hit on Thursday, and you have to have the Passover meal on Thursday night, you can't do any work on Friday because that is the Passover day. You are completely locked up in your house. You can do nothing on Passover day, which would be Friday. But what happens at the close of the day on Friday? What happens every week on Friday evening? They begin the Sabbath day. So Passover falls on Friday, Sabbath falls on Saturday. Now what can you do on the Sabbath day? What are you going to do for your kids? What are you going to do for your animals? What are you going to do if you've got 2 days in a row that you can't function? You can't do anything. So the Jewish leaders, in their wisdom, moved the official Passover from Thursday to Friday so that when the sun went down on Friday and the Sabbath began, they were celebrating both Passover and Sabbath on one day. My Jewish friends tell me, don't worry about that. We're Jewish. We have 2 ways of doing everything. There's the old calendar way, and there's the new calendar way.
We do that now with our holidays.
All the time.
Friday or Monday to make the long weekends.
And my birthday, as important as that is, we often don't celebrate it on one day. We celebrate it whenever everybody can get together. Okay? So that's the reason why one can say, yes, we had the Seder meal. Yes, they did, on the official day according to the old calendar. Here's the other part. And I want you to kind of just get the goosebumps again. Are you ready? Goosebumps, you ready? Do you know the Jewish festival that happens on the day after Passover? Are you aware? A week before Passover, the farmers of the Jewish community would go out and tie a string around the first tiny little buds of their barley grains that were coming out as the new plants were just beginning to sprout up through and just were beginning to get the grains. And they would tie a marking string around them, and then they would leave them set. On Sunday morning, at dawn, the very first moment of the day, they were required to do the first fruits festival. They would go out into their fields, they would pick the grains that they had marked, they would take them in their hands and hold them up for God to see and wave them as a gift offering of first fruits to God. If Jesus is killed as a Passover lamb and put into the tomb over the Sabbath, the very next morning, it'd be Sunday morning, we call it Easter in our calendar, at the start of the morning, at very dawn, he becomes the first fruits of all those who will rise from the dead and live forever, who have completely overcome death. The first fruits waved before God himself. If he would have been in the tomb on the official Passover on Thursday, it would still be the Sabbath. Isn't it interesting? And they couldn't take the barley out and wave it as the first fruits. It would have been work. They had to move it in order so that the festival could celebrate the resurrection of Christ. It's just as cool. I'm sorry. It's just as cool the way God moves this plan together and makes it so amazingly beautiful. Isn't that cool? I think
They
so.
weren't celebrating.
What was that?
They weren't celebrating Jesus.
No, they were celebrating first fruits.
Yeah,
And because he came from the dead
yeah.
during that festival, he becomes the first fruits of all those who will.
Who will believe in him?
That's right.
But they still.
Well, no, well, a lot
They
of them
still
are. You
don't.
would be surprised. There are Christians who are Jewish
Yes.
who run One for Israel, and they do all kinds of video things. And Jewish people in Israel are coming to Jesus by the thousands. It's unbelievable. I love to watch their videos and see how God's working in the Jewish people. Really cool.
Cool.
All right? I'm going to do one more. I'm sorry. I just can't stop this. The communion discourse is the one where he actually takes, you have to eat my body and drink my blood. The same kind of discussion he has in that upper room. So he's actually doing it in public. If you want to have the hair on your head raise up, on the back of your neck raise up, read the section called the I Am Discourse, which is the next one. It's a long one, 716 to 859. There's a story in the middle you have to kind of lift out for a second. It's the story of the woman who was caught in adultery, and that doesn't really fit in there. But if you read it through, straight through, past that and on, and you come to the end, Jesus keeps using the phrase, I am so-and-so, I am this, I am that, I am that. Well, the name for God comes from those same words. What is your name? I am. That's what Moses asked. Who can I say sent me? Just tell them, I am sent you. Okay? Well, in the I am discourse, it gets more and more intense, more and more emotional, more and more powerful. You can't be anything. You can't do that. You're a young man. Moses lived hundreds of years ago. Abraham lived hundreds of years. You're just saying this. You're not really in authority to say that. And at the end, Jesus says, before Abraham existed, I am. With an exclamation point. And they picked up stones to stone him to death. It's the most powerful discourse in the entire Bible. Even before Abraham, I am. Okay. I'm already past the time. Do you have any questions? Do you have any comments? I hope you can feel like you've gotten a couple of nuggets out of my little gold mine. All right? Because Jesus just keeps bringing the truth and the certainty and the unquestioned authority back again and again and again and again. In fact, I'm going to do one more little phrase. Maybe the most important story in all of the fourth gospel happens in the 19th chapter. When Jesus takes Peter, his number one follower of the 12, and says, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, you know I love you. Then feed my sheep. And then again he says, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, you know I love you. Feed my lambs. And then Jesus says, Peter, do you really love me? And Peter's upset by now. And he said, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And he said, feed my sheep. Now, that was a conversation between Peter and Jesus. So how do we know that the writer of the fourth gospel was in that conversation?
He recorded it.
He recorded it, yes. But actually it makes it easy. Because as soon as Peter had responded the third time, he turns to Jesus and said, well, what about him? And points to the beloved disciple that is telling the story. Even that private conversation was overheard and reported by the Gospel of John. I believe if there was one lingering question, the writer says, I am the beloved disciple. And I tell you that you can be for certain. And I believe what he was saying is, you need to answer the question just like Peter did. In absolute certainty, do you really love him? That's the last great discourse. And the question lingers over and over and over. It just stays suspended in the air. Do you really love him? And if you do love him, and we do, I'm not arguing that we don't, show it. Feed my sheep. Take care of my lambs. Do the work I've given you to do. You follow? That makes John our mission statement. Go out here and take care of business just like I showed you. Would you join me in a word of prayer? Dear Jesus, we want to show you that we love you. We want you to know what's in our hearts. And the way we do that, according to the question you gave Peter, the challenge you gave Peter, was show it by being the shepherd of my people, the one who takes care of my lambs, who feeds and heals and nurtures and encourages the flock. We ask, Lord, that you'll give us a chance to show how much we love you by showing how much we love the people you gave your life to save. And we ask that you'll just give us the strength and the wisdom and the courage to face every new challenge and give you the praise in every way. Amen. Thank you.